Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Saving the World podcast with Martin Rezny and Luke Macmichael. Today, we've definitely got a lot of interesting things to talk about, a lot of chaos in the world. It's every day comes with new news articles. It's so hard to turn your head away from it. Sometimes you just want to bury your head in the sand and forget it's all happening. But here we're going to talk about it. We're going to dig as deep as we can, come up with some ideas on how to resolve this crisis, if it's not already resolved by the time we post this. But hopefully we can come up with some good ideas. This might be a long-term thing that we're thinking about for years, but let's talk about it today. So what do you think, Martin? What's your opinion on the crisis so far? Give everyone an update on where we are as we're posting this, and let's dig into some of the possible solutions to this.
Right. So, it's kind of happening in my corner of the world. So I can't really effectively bury my head in the sand because the sand is still pretty close to the situation in which my head would have been buried. So it's like family drama, like sort of talked about a little bit before now. Family drama is something that does describe the situation fairly well because the Slavic nations are thought of as a family because both they're part of are part of the same linguistic family. Languages that are so similar to each other that you can pick up no matter which particular Slavic nation you're from, you can pick up a lot of what the other nations are talking about, even if you haven't studied the language or if you haven't been there for any extended period of time or known people from there. So it's close in that way, but also, which is related to that, is also close in that there's a lot of interconnectedness between the particular families and societies between across borders, because within this sort of Slavic sphere, many people travel from various countries to work in other countries. Like, for instance, the case with Czech Republic is that there are many Ukrainians here and always have been, because they migrate here for work. Because of all the Slavic nations, Czech Republic is one of the better destinations for work. If you're from to east of Czech Republic, then usually you can make more money in Czech Republic and definitely be able to get a job, because we have a bit of an excess amount of jobs, especially at the moment. So everybody here pretty much can't be ignoring the situation, because in terms of proximity, there's Czech Republic. To the east of Czech Republic is Slovakia, and Slovakia is already bordering on Ukraine. So it's basically, if we were Czechoslovakia, like we used to be before, they would be our neighbor country at this point. So basically, they are our neighbor country. So where it is right now, the situation is that, and I usually, as a debater, I always try to see both sides of the argument and try to find, understand where every party is coming from, especially in a conflict. It just doesn't seem to be super justifiable this time on any level, because what you get is an invasion. You could be along with Russian media calling it some sort of special operation, but that really feels Orwellian. It is if anything is an invasion, this is an invasion. The Ukrainians are not welcoming the Russians by any stretch of the imagination. And the Russians have left their own country with military equipment and soldiers and moved it to another country to take it over. So I think invasion is fair. What's worse, however, is that it would be one thing if there was an invasion because of some sort of historical land claim or some such or another, but otherwise it would be happening within the bounds of international law, basically what's allowed to be happening in conflicts. But it doesn't appear. Again, Russia TV and state media are probably painting a different picture. But again, I think there's an abundance of clips, video evidence, and accounts, and all kinds of data that show that there are war crimes happening. Basically, that the civilians are being targeted, and so that's where we're at. I think the last development, which was again not exactly a thing anybody should do in a war, was a takeover of a nuclear power plant. That was also a bit of another kind of line entirely that's been crossed. And so the response of NATO countries was that we very much don't want to be fighting a war with Russians, really super don't want to. And we're really trying very hard not to at this point, but it's really getting to a point where I guess it would almost even be like really feel justified, because it's like when you start to get into the territory of like nuclear accidents again in Ukraine, because again it's in Ukraine. That's even it's like, yeah, let's roll that dice, and there are already sort of indications that Russians will be trying to take over more nuclear power plants in Ukraine, which was historically the place where the biggest ever nuclear power plant disaster has occurred. So it's really not a great situation, and that's, I think, where we're at right now.
Well, so let me summarize, or let me get my word in from my, trying to be a third party perspective from the other side of the world. And again, I'm a little bit like you, where I love looking at both sides. I trying to get inside Putin's head and trying to understand, what is he actually hoping to accomplish? Why on earth did he do this? And I guess Trump made a couple of comments that it's a genius move early in the thing, because the rest of the world, he didn't think they were united enough to do anything about it, and he thought, Ukraine's an easy target. Let's grab it back. Let's reunite the Soviet Union, reunite the motherland. I guess in his mind, all those countries should be united. They're all part of the same country. When he was, I guess, part of the Kremlin as a spy for the Soviet Union. So in his mind, he's just trying to rebuild that great, glorious, state. And so I can kind of understand that as a goal. He wants to reunite the motherland, or however you phrase it, in order to combat the influence of the West, right? The U.S. are bringing NATO further. He feels threatened by NATO. He feels like if he doesn't do something now, eventually they'll take all the countries from them, and they'll lose their Russian identity somehow, or they'll lose their power as the U.S. gets more influence over the world. But yeah, so I guess that's his side, trying to understand it from his side. But it definitely seemed to backfire, like really hard. Like it almost seemed like he united the entire world against him, except maybe China and a few other small countries. But even they're kind of looking like they might unite against him. So it just feels like he thought something would be easy, and he thought it'd be up for grabs, and he would just snag it without anyone else really caring that much. And he would come up with some kind of quick deal with Ukraine to kind of reunite them, and they'd be one happy country. I feel like that's what he was hoping, but now it kind of blew up in his face, and now he's just trying to scramble and not look like a total terrorist, and brainwash his people, or tell his people that they're the Nazis, they're the terrorists, we have to stop them. Right, that's the only thing he can do now. They're bombing themselves, or something like that, he might say. Right, they're launching terrorist strikes, and we have to go and stop the Nazis. So it's really interesting when you try to get inside his head. Like, what is he actually thinking? And the things he says and the things he does, it's like completely different, and you just can't really understand. Is he just a total madman now? Maybe somehow. I mean, it's hard to say. So where do we go from here is the real question. How do we get out of this mess? Regardless of what started it, how can we get him to maybe save a little bit of face and go home with some kind of reason or understanding behind it, and have some kind of future where he is not in bars, because if he's going to go to bars, he'll probably nuke the world before he does that, or before he allows himself to go down. If he strikes me as a guy that'll go down with the ship pretty easily, just not caring about anyone else in the world. I think he'd rather nuke us than lose power in Russia, perhaps, which is very, very scary. But what's your take on it? Is there any other way?
Well, let me give you a bit of a down-to-earth Slavic perspective on the situation, because it's sort of this kind of stuff that's sort of cultural here, that like Slavic people understand between each other, and the sort of history in the region and stuff, like for people who actually are here, that's kind of hard to explain to people from like North America. And that people from North America and such places that are very distant don't seem to understand very easily. And that's the thing about Russia is it's not any kind of 5D chess. What they're doing is not complicated. It's very straightforward, blunt. I want things, I'm going to go with tanks to take things. And at this point, problem for Putin is, like, I agree that he probably thought it's going to be way easier and way quicker. The problem is that the mentality is also he can't show, or like afford to show weakness. So at this point, it's like he's committed. It's like he can't just like say like oops, like no harm, no foul, and just like go back. He can't just do that. He still in his mind needs to have a victory in there somewhere, which in again the super simple, straightforward, blunt Russian way of doing politics means like take land or have a country be under control of Russia, which means like you install, like I think he already was floating around. Yanukovych is like the ex president of Ukraine who was basically overthrown in the revolution because he sided against his people with Russia. So there's whole history there. So he's already sort of that's what he ideally would have wanted. It really seems that like it's just not going to happen. So like at the same time, it is really important in these sorts of conflicts. Like if you want to somehow end it, then I am afraid you're right that the leader has to have some sort of like you have to give that person like Putin some sort of like off ramp, like way to like save face and quit, which definitely unfortunately won't lead to like such a person being tried in some sort of like tribunal. Like that's not going to happen, much like it didn't happen in any by any stretch of the imagination with people like Bush and his cabinet. It's just not going to happen with such a powerful country like with nukes. It's just not going to happen. It's just but I guess like most of the world would be just fine with okay, let's just make this stop. Like I think we would sacrifice the further steps. Like let then like I don't know, God sort it out later. It's just like at least like just this has to stop. This is basically I believe the attitude, because if you look at the situation like what it did with NATO, Germans really didn't want to have to do anything militarily about this. Like Germans really wanted to use diplomacy and trade and everything like that you could do as a pacifist, basically, because Germany still was very much in the frame of mind like after World War II, we just can never even appear to be anything like the Nazis again, which again from like in a country like Czech Republic, it's like it's great. This is like it's just go Germany being pacifist. Like we love that. That's great, because if you think about it, like you have an alliance like NATO where there are countries like Germany and Czech Republic allies militarily in it. That's just like such a complete upheaval of how it's always been in these relations, and it would be so great if with Russia it could work also like this. Unfortunately, Russia still didn't let go of their like Soviet sort of style imperial ideas, which just in Europe, I think like the greatest development in Europe and the best positive about the European Union is that like Europe as a continent has pretty much moved beyond that. This is just like decided, like pretty much like with the exception of Russia, it's just like really decided that like that's kind of stuff really needs to stay in the past, and we just can't do that again, not in a world with nuclear weapons. So yeah, you have to give a person like Putin, you give him some sort of way out. I'm just like not sure what at this point it could be that would be satisfactory, because I think the sort of biggest upset to Putin, or like the sort of upset of his plans, is Zelensky, and like how he basically did as a leader, like it's like the best possible leader response to it, and completely united Ukraine, which wasn't the case previously. Like Ukraine wasn't actually super united against Russia. It is now. Like the sort of Putin, like if you wanted to look at it like that, Putin is actually being helpful in the world, is that like he really united Ukraine and moved it toward the West, and he really united European Union and NATO again and the rest of the Western world, and reminded everybody how like, oh wait, like we actually have values that our systems are built upon that are actually pretty good values, like the sort of freedom, self-determination, and international cooperation, and maybe resolving things without using military. So sort of just everybody now realizes like, yeah, we're actually pretty good, and this is better, and we don't want that, so let's like super double down on the better thing. So in that sense, like Putin's been very helpful lately, but still that doesn't really explain how it can end with other than like a nuclear war.
Well, so let's think about potential possibilities. So we mentioned, obviously escalation, nuclear wars is the scariest, and the one that I don't even think Putin wants himself, unless he's, going to die. I don't think he would ever want to go that far, but if he's pushed into a rat in a corner, he'll probably do whatever he's got to do. So let's just put that one aside as It's definitely one that could happen, but definitely the main one we want to avoid. So the other potential one would be some kind of deal, economic deal perhaps, where the whole world gets together and offers Putin some kind of economic reparation to say, hey, apologize, get out of Ukraine, we'll give you $1 billion or $1 trillion or whatever, some kind of economic incentive to just get him out of there, maybe. That's a potential solution. I don't know if the rest of the world is into that because they're also angry at him right now, and most of the world would probably love to just see him hanged or assassinated or something, heaven forbid. But I don't know if his own people might ever rise up against him and do something like that. It's potentially possible. But so I guess that. So you pay him off somehow, make some kind of deal with him that he can save some face and get paid off. That's probably, the best for everyone if you can get people to stomach it, maybe. And then the third one is, of course, some kind of revolution in Russia, where the Russian people turn against him and say, hey, we don't want this either. We don't want World War III. Or, maybe he tries to do something extreme, like attack a NATO country, because attacking a NATO country in any form would probably start World War III right away. So if his own people or his own generals somehow turn against him, that would probably be a pretty good solution as well. They just overthrew him, no more Putin power. Russia could definitely save a lot of face as a country if they just overthrew him, and we could probably move towards a united world government in some form, or united world, let's just say united world powers of some form, where we're all working together. We don't have to worry about war as much. This could be the last major scare. If we can get out of this well, we might be able to get out of every future major war the same way. So I think those are the three things that we could learn from this. Any others that you can think of? China maybe could have some effect. They could maybe sanction Russia a little bit, and then maybe we can kind of pull his economic resources to the point where he has no money to work with. If we can just stop buying his oil, stop relying on his economic resources, and just completely isolate him, maybe like we do with North Korea a little bit, and just kind of go about our own way, and hopefully he'll run out of money, or he'll realize that he can't wage a war without the world economy kind of backing him at least a little bit, maybe. What do you think of those? Which is the most likely, and is there any others that I'm not thinking of?
Well, so let's go through them in order. Nuclear war, yeah, I don't think it's very, very super high likelihood of that happening, because it is more likely that he is at least rational enough to just be talking about it, because he's just being pushed into a corner, and he just that's the only way he can like sort of message to the NATOs is like, just don't meddle, don't interfere in the situation, but as a bluff. That's like that almost definitely a bluff. And if it wasn't, then I think that greatly increases the likelihood that someone from his staff would just make him have an accident, because self-preservation and self-interest would be high motivators for these people. And the sort of sway Putin has over them is intimidation, by basically making it clear that if they were against him, like, he would kill them, or maybe do something would happen to their families, which a nuclear war is worse. So that's not that hard of a choice, even for a person who is not very scoring very high on integrity, because then it's just self-preservation. So I don't think that I believe that the chance for that is very low. It's not zero, which by itself really sucks, but it's I think the worst that would really happen was maybe there would be like a tactical nuke strike on some single location, and then that would just escalate the end. By which I mean not like by a nuclear war, but somebody doing a coup against him or something, because that's the point at which it's again, it would really motivate Russians to do something about it. It's also good historical precedent for this kind of thing, where you usually have multiple people who have to authorize it. Historically, there have been some sort of near misses or real scares, and in all of those instances, there was some person who was necessary to launch it just decided not to do it in basically every single instance. So I think that's not an accident. I think that's a pattern, meaning that if you're the person who would has a button to end humanity, those people would generally, if they think about it a little bit, would decide well, even if they fire all the nukes on us and all of us die, if we don't kill all of them, then at least there are some humans left. So that's the point that sort of then individual morality sort of transcends transcends is sort of like a obedience to an authoritarian figure. At least in most, it seems in most cases. It seems even because some of these happened even in the Soviet Union. So, and Soviet Union was more ideological, and there was actually a harder control, like of like people's minds. Like the soldiers were more brainwashed than they would be now in Russia, because Russia now is, and I think that's also important to like ending this. Russia now isn't a totalitarian regime. There's a distinction. It is an authoritarian regime. That's one of the first things they teach you in political science classes, at least in the Czech Republic, which are in Brno Masaryk University in my faculty, are very focused on like studying these kinds of regimes. There is even like a special institute like dedicated to studying them. And so totalitarian regime is based on ideology, and it's based on trying to control and micromanage what everybody is thinking and saying and doing at all times. So it's a regime that has some sort of ideology, which could be that Aryan race is the best, or it could be communism, or it could be basically anything. That the people then can get, especially those who are selected to be in the like military or its police or positions of power, could be like really believing fanatically. It's the likelihood of that could be pretty high. In authoritarian regimes, it's basically just a dictator on top, and that's sort of an older form of government. It's a more usual form of government, where the person on top is using intimidation to sort of bully people into submission, and that doesn't have any ideological component. That usually means that there's a very high likelihood that the people thus bullied and intimidated won't be actually believing in that, like that the dictator is the greatest or that the country is the greatest. Like the levels of that would be much lower. And for something like nuclear war, that's important, because the person who would fire the nukes would have to be somebody who's very ideologically, fanatically believing in their cause. If it's somebody who's just being intimidated into doing stuff, then such people would realize that like, doing that would be worse. So that sort of would be the breaking point, more likely for these people. So at the same time, it also means that it's highly unlikely that there will be some sort of like civil uprising. Like that's not going to happen, because overall, the Russian population seems to be divided usually along the age lines, like sort of like the people like above, let's say 30, 40, people who are still just watching the state TV and basically not questioning anything. And it's more so, it's an important distinction, not really necessarily believing some sort of propaganda, but not questioning is I think more the default. It's sort of like to just trying to get by without like causing any waves. It's more normal mentality, because I've seen some interviews with people in the streets, and many of them were actually like sort of vaguely supportive of the war, but those weren't like that they like hate Ukrainians with a passion. That was like none of them. They basically just didn't question what's happening enough to arrive at the conclusion that like what's happening is pretty bad. But if they like somehow have seen it with their own eyes, they would probably acknowledge that it's bad. But that's just not going to happen. Like the civic society is basically dead in Russia, because then you have most of the younger people who have international friends who know English, who can get the information, because the censorship in or the control over media in Russia now is weaker than it was in the communist Soviet Union, and is weaker than it is now in China. Meaning that if you really want to get the information and you have access to the internet, you will get it. You will just like, or like have a conversation over the phone with someone who will tell you. So they basically know, but those people, when I've seen interviews with them, were like, yeah, but there's nothing we can do. Because like if you then try to go protest, then you're locked up. And that's basically it. Putin is like sitting at this point, sitting like at least 100 meters from the closest human being at all times. So that sort of indicates how sort of paranoid he probably is at this point, that somebody might try to like overthrow him. So a regular person, just like, or just a group of people protesting in the streets, like there's no way for them to in any way get close to Putin to be able to do anything meaningful. And it's not like there could be an election to like change stuff. It's just, that's just not going to happen like in that sense. Like so the only people who would be able to overthrow him would be people who are close to him, as like to the extent to which anybody is close to him, and it's also in some sort of empowered position, which is why I think it's interesting that the sanctions, the economic sanctions, actually seem to be doing something, which usually is not the case, because I think usually they're half-hearted and not really pushed to their maximum potential. And so as the sort of weapon of choice of the civilized world, I think it has done more damage than even Putin has thought that it's going to, because he was preparing for it for years. Like with the making themselves basically independent on the SWIFT banking system, so that when that's shut down, it doesn't sort of topple them over. But I think the most effective ones were, I think it was the ones targeted against the sort of national bank, or like the couple of the most important banks who don't have access to their gold reserves and other sort of foreign assets, and therefore have difficulty stabilizing ruble. So I think those seem to be actually quite effective. So there is a mounting pressure from the oligarchs, it appears, on Putin. And those are the kinds of people that, even without directly overthrowing Putin, do have some influence over his decision making ultimately, because you still do need some kind of money from somewhere to wage a war. So that could work. That conceivably, if it takes long enough, that could be one of the sort of motivating factors for Putin to, in some way, be open to withdrawing. Again, if he's given some concessions, like at this point, I believe he will definitely want to keep Crimea and Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk, those regions. But honestly, at this point, I think Ukraine would probably let them have it. If they would just their position, their starting negotiating position would always be no concessions, but ultimately you start at a position that's stronger than what you're willing to accept. So I think they would be willing to accept it, because at this point there are no Ukrainian people in those regions at this moment. So it's just that's basically not a part of Ukraine in any sense that would make sense for the Ukraine to try to take it. You would have to basically do something like actually happened in Czechoslovakia with the Sudetenland, like the sort of conquered border areas of Czechoslovakia by the Nazis. Sort of the after the war, I think it was before. I'm sort of getting confused. No, after the Germans basically were forcibly resettled from there to Germany. So I think you would still have to, with the Luhansk and Donetsk, you would have to basically take all the people there and forcibly move them to Russia, and then resettle with Ukrainians from the western parts of the Ukraine. So at this point, I think it would be more trouble than it's worth anyway. So I think that could be technically still seen by Putin as some sort of a victory, that the independent republics of Luhansk and Donetsk were sort of saved. And it's however it would be spun with the propaganda machine. So I think pragmatically, if there's enough pressure from his sort of other leadership in Russia on Putin, mainly because of the economic sanctions that seem to be doing something, then assuming that Ukraine won't fall or capitulate soon, which really doesn't seem likely, because that was really the surprising part to everybody, was that how the Ukrainians just decided to make it a new Stalingrad type of situation. They just really decided, just nope. Just I think that's the part that was most shocking to Putin, because on some level, I think the Russian forces really thought that they will be welcomed by somebody in Ukraine as well, if not liberators, then at least people won't be resisting, because they will be basically fine with being under the Russian rule, and that's just not the case at all. That it looks like not at all. I think the indication of that could have been the sort of overwhelming majority with which Zelensky was elected. And I think that was also shocking to the Russians, and Putin especially, was that Zelensky wasn't just some sort of a installed Western puppet that doesn't really care about the country, but is in it just for the money or something. Because on some level, many people had doubts. I think even many people in the West and in Ukraine would have doubts. I seen an interview with one of his ministers, I think, who was even saying saying that even some of us, the sort of his sort of leadership, were surprised by the extent to which he really just decided to make a stand. That was really, I guess maybe before he could have been more of a cowardly person, but just this sort of transformed him into this better kind of leader. But that's just undeniable. There are people even in Czech Republic or in other Slavic countries like again, it's like a family thing. So you have like not all parts of the family like are equally liked by all the other parts of the family, and there's just like squabbles and stereotypes and nonsense like that. And like Ukrainians before now haven't been considered like the favorite like Slavic people of the rest of the Slavic people, but like that seems to be changing also, because like sort of if you wanted to make a case for Ukraine to be part of European Union or NATO or well Europe, like as a civilization, like their actions during this conflict are proving it, because it's like they're sort of more fiercely defending these sort of principles than I think any of the other currently like in European Union, NATO countries, in the other Slavic countries would have. It's possible that like the Poles maybe would be putting up similar resistance. It's possible. I'm pretty sure that Czechs and Slovaks would just capitulate because we don't do war or like even military defense. Like our sort of point of view is that sort of empires come and go. And so it's just like always like welcoming our new overlords and just like waiting them out is basically our strategy, which has worked historically. So it's not that it wouldn't work, but again, the responses would be different. So that's why, like, for instance, and I guess I need to address it because I already wrote a whole article again about it on Medium, because I wrote some sort of lengthy comment on, do you know Jimmy Dore's show? Jimmy Dore, comedian, news person. So, and he had Aaron Mate, which is, I think, independent journalist on, and they were sort of discussing how this whole thing is basically American fault, and really only stressing that angle without like once mentioning that maybe the whole invasion thing is kind of bad. So I sort of like written some sort of perspective on that, and then the comment I believe was immediately deleted. And then I've looked at all the comments under the video, of which there were many, but all of them were positive. So I guess I should have seen it coming, that they're not like leaving there anything that disagrees with them. So that sort of spurred me to write an article and just, like, if I may, actually post my opinion somewhere on that, because you could be making all kinds of arguments that like it was in a way provoked by United States because United States were like meddling in Ukrainian sort of political situation with the whole revolution thing. And that's the thing. And even if you start the sentence like this, sort of what doesn't follow from it logically is that, and therefore Putin is justified to be blowing up people in apartment buildings. It's like, there's like, what they're doing isn't justified by any first half of that sentence, because that's just war crime. That's just not justified. So sure. But then even if you think about it as a coup, then it's like, okay, so what actually happened was that Ukrainians elected a president who said that they are pro-Western, like, because they want to move into NATO and European Union, because that's what the people were supporting. And then the president, like at the moment when he was supposed to like sign like the focusing on going on to the West, was like, how about we instead become like the vassals of Russia? So the Ukrainian people kind of didn't like that. And I'm sure some sort of American agents helped the revolution like smoothly work out so that the will of the Ukrainian people is sort of upheld again, which then they upheld again by electing Zelensky, again being like demonstrating that what they want is to be pro-Western. So in that sense, you could be like, so I guess like it was a coup, but I guess not all coups are evil. Because it's like there's a vast difference in like a coup that goes like sabotages the will of the people, and like a coup, even from an external actor, that actually helps to restore the will of the people. Then like you have to be making that distinction. So you say like, saying basic arguments like Americans basically started it because they meddled in Ukrainian politics. It's like, and what do you think the Russians were doing? Like, do you think Russians didn't have agents there who were working to do the exact opposite? It's like, and the exact opposite was what the Ukrainians actually didn't want. So it's like the whole situation is a bit realpolitik, like this sort of why do we have to have spies at all doing stuff? But again, like I'm sort of 100% for just making sure that you describe the reality as it really happened. But that includes, you can't be just criticizing one side, or like not following your arguments through to their conclusion. Like I think if Putin, if all he did, or Russians did, was that they captured the Luhansk and Donetsk regions and just decided, I will keep them, then I think the rest of the world would be like, well, yeah, I guess they have some kind of point. Let's give it to them. Like the issue is, how much further they went beyond what would be any conceivable legitimate claim. I think this is the main point that I think people should understand about the situation.
Yeah, and I think the biggest scare for most of us is if Ukraine were to just capitulate, then what would be next, right? He would go. Would he ever attack a NATO country? And what if Ukraine decided right now to just join NATO? Would they let them, and would they have to defend them at that point? What if they decided 3 weeks ago to just sign a quick contract? Hey, let's join NATO right now before Russia attacks us. That could have definitely changed things. Maybe he wouldn't have attacked at all if that was the case.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, because I think that's an important point. Because if you're trying to construe the argument as that in any way not the Russia's fault, then you have to really think about what NATO is. NATO is a defensive alliance. Usually in, again, realpolitik, like it's just propaganda, they're really trying to take over, but they're just lying about it and stuff. NATO, let's look at actions, not words. NATO is such a defensive-only alliance that doesn't want to wage war, that even when there's a war on their borders and the country that's being invaded by the Russians is saying that it wants to join and just wants to the very basic military intervention, which is the no-fly zone, then the NATO, even though it's like 100% against the invasion, the situation happening at all, 100% would want Ukraine to join, is like, no, we can't do that. Because we don't actually want a war with Russia. It's like, conversely, Russia, like you said, the only way to prevent Russia, I think, eventually invading or having a special military operation in Ukraine is if Ukraine was in NATO, because it's a defensive alliance that works as a deterrent. That's like it's a threat, like people are saying, like, well, Americans or NATO are threatening Russia. It's only a threat to Russia expanding into sovereign countries that are their neighbors that don't want them. That's the only thing that the NATO is a threat to. There's like no universe in which the Americans have like somehow duped Czechs and Slovaks and Poles and Hungarians into joining NATO, like just to sell them weapons or whatever to wage war on Russia, because there's no universe in which countries like the Czech Republic have joined NATO to wage war with Russia on Russian territory. That's just not what it's about. Germans, like the strongest country in Europe and one of the most important countries within NATO, is like so much against war in principle that they, like, even as the invasion was already ongoing, was still trying to have some sort of diplomatic deal made with Russians. So it's just false equivalence if you try to pretend like NATO and Russia are basically the same thing. It's just not.
So I think that leads us back to probably the best solution, possibly for everyone, even Russia themselves, is to make some kind of quick deal, at least a ceasefire, at least a temporary ceasefire, and then give Ukraine time to maybe negotiate to join NATO. And then Russia can keep, like you said, whatever lands they negotiate on, whatever is fair enough for him to at least have some kind of victory. And then Ukraine and maybe any other country that's ever worried about being conquered by Russia or China, join NATO or join the Pacific. Maybe there's a Pacific one that's similar, I guess. I'm not even familiar. But there probably is. I think Japan and the U.S. are allies as well. If someone were to attack Japan, I think they have some agreement there. There's tons of U.S. bases there. So bottom line is, this is a good lesson for any future country that ever doesn't want to be conquered by Russia or China or some other similar country. Just sign up, join NATO. We'll make a worldwide defensive organization for any country that wants to avoid this in the future.
Because I think there's a lot of silver lining to this situation. And one of it is that it appears that it works. Like, if you as a country decide to be a part of a global defense alliance, and it's really a defense alliance, it's really just never going to attack anybody, then that is a deterrent. It's in fact such a deterrent to invaders, like isolated lone countries that would try to do it, that they would really try to do everything that they can to prevent it, preempt it, like the joining of their country into such an alliance, using, of course, spies and also like going for an invasion if like it really looks like it can't be stopped by any other means, then doing it as long as they still have time to do it before thing actually occurs. That just all proves how much it works.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think this definitely could be a great thing for the world if we can come out it smoothly and somehow make some kind of negotiation with them, open up the economic ties again with Russia. And who knows? Why wouldn't Russia join NATO? I mean, eventually, what's the big deal? Like, what would they have to give up to join NATO? And why is he so against NATO? Is the real question.